Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here.
How did black soldiers on both sides of the conflict fare as the war came to an end? For the most part, promises of freedom made by the British or colonial governments were kept. At first, black loyalists who had served the British were terrified by the thought that they would be returned to their masters and perhaps even killed. The Treaty of Paris demanded that the British return any Negroes or other property of the American inhabitants. Black loyalists based in southern states at the time of the treaty were less fortunate, and many were returned to their masters. On the American side, most promises were honored to slaves who had agreed to fight the British in exchange for freedom. Most, but not all. Some masters, men who had sent slaves to fight while they themselves stayed at home, put their Revolutionary War veterans back to work in the fields. This happened often enough that the Virginia legislature passed a law forbidding it. The American Revolution was the beginning of the end of slavery in the North. The Somerset decision in 1772 had stirred up powerful abolitionist feelings, particularly among Quakers. The language and emotions of the Declaration of Independence and the quest for liberty forced many to point to the contradiction of a land of freedom enslaving hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children. And certainly, the valor of black patriots aided the cause of freedom for the nation and for slaves in the North. The Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 declared all men born free and equal. In a case much like Somerset's in England, the Massachusetts slave Quock Walker sued for his freedom under the state's constitution and won. Thus ended slavery in Massachusetts. Other northern states passed emancipation laws that went into effect quickly or gradually, depending on the state. In many cases, slavery would be replaced by bitter racial prejudices. But one thing was clear. The North took the view that the war had made it a place of freedom, while the South believed that the war had secured its right to maintain the institution of slavery. In 1787, as the delegates to the Constitutional Convention met to develop the Constitution that would eventually be the foundation of the United States government, slavery was a major topic of consideration. Delegates from the northern states, which were already in the process of ending slavery, were opposed to the practice. Delegates from the South, among whom were large plantation holders, saw slavery as a necessary evil, essential to their region's production. The issue was of particular concern when deciding how to determine each state's representation in the federal government. Delegates from the South, where slaves represented about 40% of the population, wanted slaves to count as citizens when determining a state's representation. This would mean that the number of representatives a state could send to Congress would be based on the size of their total population, including slaves. But since slaves themselves would have no vote, this would give white voters in the South a disproportionately high level of representation. Further, when taxes were to be determined based on population size, the South wanted slaves to be considered property, not persons. The Northern delegates considered this a twisted logic designed to benefit Southern planters at the expense of Northern citizens. Eventually, a compromise was reached. A slave would count as 3/5 of a person, when determining both representation and taxation. The convention also dealt with the issue of the Atlantic slave trade. Every state except Georgia and the Carolinas had banned the importation of slaves from across the Atlantic. But those 3 southern states still required high levels of importation in order to maintain their workforces. Virginia and Maryland, on the other hand, saw that their slave population was growing naturally by reproduction, and no new imports were needed. In fact, these states would benefit from a restriction on international slave trade, as it would make their own slaves more valuable, and they could sell excess slaves to the Deep South. Eventually, another compromise was reached. It was agreed that the international slave trade would continue another 20 years, and that Congress could then end the trade beginning in 1808. A third major item in the Constitution with regard to slavery is the third clause of Article 4.
No person held in service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due.
Although it did not use the term slave, the point of this clause was to protect the property rights of slave owners in the event that slaves escaped to a free state. A few years later, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 would strengthen this clause by making it a crime to assist a runaway and allow slave catchers to operate in all the states and territories. At the same time as the delegates were meeting in Philadelphia on the Constitution, the Continental Congress, still operating under the Articles of Confederation, was meeting in New York. Their most important product was the Northwest Ordinance, which detailed how new territories would be opened up for the American expansion. Article 6 of the ordinance stated that there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory, otherwise than in the punishment of crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. This outlawed slavery in these Northwest territories. Southern planters were actually pleased with this decision, as they feared that if those territories were open to slave-based plantations, they would provide too much competition in cash crops, such as tobacco. The American Revolution was about liberty. In practice, it was more about the liberty of whites than blacks, but the Revolution nevertheless had a powerful impact on slavery in America. Individual slaves were given the opportunity to fight for their freedom. In the North, they were given the opportunity to join the Patriot cause and earn freedom by protecting American liberty. In the South, where several states refused to consider arming slaves, those potential patriots instead escaped their bondage to fight for the promise of freedom offered by the British. After the war, revolutionary ideals and a new abolitionist movement inspired by the Somerset decision in England led to the eventual emancipation of all slaves in northern states, though more quickly in some states than others. In the South, Southern planters felt that they had successfully defended their way of life, slavery, against the looming threat of parliamentary interference. They had no intention of letting the new government of the United States become a new threat to their means of economic production. The new Constitution denigrated slaves by counting each as less than a whole person. But it set an end date to the international trade in slaves. And the Congress sectioned off an enormous territory and declared that this portion of land should be forever free. In many ways, it seemed as if slavery might fade away in coming decades, as more citizens began to think that the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness should belong to slaves as well as free whites. But a technological marvel was less than a decade from being invented. The cotton gin would breathe new life into this peculiar institution, providing one more roadblock on our path up from slavery.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.